Now, in Paris today, more signs of tension between Washington and Kyiv as Ukraine's President Zelensky says America keeps changing the terms of the extent of a potential minerals deal it wants. It's symptomatic of a wider trend as allies and adversaries alike face a mercurial U.S. administration. Beijing has accused the United States of violating World Trade Organization rules after Trump just announced 25% tariffs on all cars and auto parts imported from anywhere in the world. In Beijing, the foreign ministry spokesman said there are no winners in a trade war or a tariff war, and he called this action unhelpful. Jessica Chen Weiss is professor of China Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and she spoke with Hari Srinivasan on how China is trying to manage an unpredictable second Trump administration.
Christian, thanks. Professor Jessica Chen Weiss, thanks so much for joining us. Just recently, we had the Chinese Development Forum, where China gets to invite foreign companies from all over the world and say, we're open for business. And I wonder, in light of what's been happening with the Trump administration in the past month or two, is it open for business as usual? Or what are the kind of changes that the Chinese are trying to lure the world with?
Well, thanks so much. It's great to be here. And the Chinese are nervous as well about all that's underway with the on and off again tariffs and the changes in U.S. foreign policy. And they have a lot of economic challenges at home. And so the China Development Forum is their annual effort to signal again that that China is, as you said, open for business. But they have a long way to go in terms of reassuring foreign investors that China plans to kind of live up to its promises to be the defender of globalization and not to follow the path of kind of unilateralism that they've criticized so much in U.S. policy recently. I mean, certainly China sees some benefit from the U.S. making itself seem like an unreliable partner, particularly in Europe, but they're quite nervous as well. China's benefited a lot from globalization, and to the extent that tariffs go up around the world, this could come at significant cost, including to Chinese growth, which remains very heavily dependent on exports, especially in light of the challenges at home.
So how much of this is an opportunity for China?
Well, I certainly think that China has been trying to build external partnerships as a way to provide some insulation from what it saw as kind of U.S.-led containment, suppression, sanctions. And so to the extent that the United States is no longer an attractive economic partner, China stands to benefit. But at the same time, a loss for the United States isn't necessarily a win for China. I don't think that China is necessarily going to fill the void that the United States has left in many parts of the world, particularly in global health.
So in global health, if we stop vaccine distributions, China doesn't necessarily have the infrastructure to stand up the equivalent of USAID, right?
Exactly. But China's, I think, not capable and not particularly interested in making those kinds of investments, which is, I think, a loss for the world. And Americans too, because I think the early detection and containment of infectious diseases, like Ebola, has benefited many Americans. And I think the greater risk here is not that some China steps up and fills the void, but instead kind of the disintegration of many of the international efforts that had once, I think, kept many of these diseases at bay.
Is there something different about Trump 1.0 versus 2.0 in terms of not just the posturing, but actually the policies that they're laying out? Because we saw tariffs against China in the first administration. Is there something different now? Is it just the level of uncertainty?
I think there's a big difference already out of the gate between the two Trump administrations. I think that everybody expected that these tariffs would be used as leverage against China, potentially to extract better terms, maybe get them to live up to their end of the first trade deal. But instead, we're seeing much more priority actually on U.S. allies and partners, some of our closest ones in Canada, Mexico. We're also seeing new rhetoric about the desire to take Greenland one way or the other. Calling into question, really, I think some of the most fundamental principles of norms against territorial aggression and expansion that have really been, I think, important to holding even authoritarian powers like China and Russia in check. So that's a really big departure, and I think that many American allies, especially in Europe and in Canada, are now looking to the United States and wondering if their greatest threat is not at all China, but the United States instead. And so, a big part of, I think, American strength is run through our alliances and partnerships. And those are very much, I think, being called into question.
I wonder what the lessons are that China takes as the United States postures much closer towards Russia. In light of Ukraine, a lot of people have been saying, how the United States deals with Ukraine is going to be a signal for China on what it could do with Taiwan.
I think China is quite nervous about the rapprochement between the United States and Russia, but I also don't think they think it can go that far. And certainly, I think Xi and Putin have taken pains to reassure one another that their partnership isn't driven by these external factors, and it remains strong. But I think that China sees both benefits and risks. I think on the one hand, the United States is, I think, undermining many of its key strengths, not only the allies and partners, but also, I think, the domestic basis of the domestic basis of American kind of science and technology leadership. And so we're witnessing a kind of brain drain that China is benefiting from, Europe is benefiting from, France, others are luring American scientists who see a dead end for their careers here now in the new climate. But they also, I think, in China see risks, that, again, China's in a really difficult domestic position now, and they've been trying over the last couple of years to stabilize their the kind of external environment, not shying away from punching back, but nonetheless not looking, I think, to provoke escalation or conflict. And so I don't see them necessarily crowing that loudly, although they're certainly happy to point out to American allies and partners just how unreliable the United States has been of late, and that China, continues to portray itself as a defender of the status quo in contrast to the United States.
I wonder if the work that China has been doing across what we would consider the global South, the partnerships with the Belt and Road Initiative, the investments in, even in, say, India, Pakistan, sort of different regions are paying off now, if that's as good of a hedge as you need.
I think they've been pretty effective as a hedge. China has, since the first trade war, really tried to diversify away from the United States toward what we call South-South relationships. And that trade has become increasingly important to China, and I think provides real kind of insurance for Chinese businesses seeking access to markets as well as raw inputs. And it means that when the United States raises tariffs against China and China retaliates, and as the United States takes on many of its top trading partners, with greater tariffs, and the risk is that the United States actually isolates itself from the world, and that China continues, to court those who are, I think, wary of the element of chaos that the United States is introducing into the global trading system.
There are discussions right now about a gold pass that would offer basically citizenship into the United States for about $5 million. And the Trump administration and the Commerce Secretary expect to sell 1 million of these. And they said, well, look at the number of Chinese businessmen or people that could come over with their families. Is that, given where kind of the tensions are right now, is that something that the Chinese billionaires want to have in their side pocket, is just an opportunity to leave China and go to the United States? Or do they see kind of both as unstable or unpredictable?
I think that there are a huge number of Chinese that would like to take their investments and assets elsewhere where they feel safer. But I don't know that in the current environment, the United States feels like the safest of havens, which is really a missed opportunity. If anything, I think, at least in the science and technology domain, we are seeing a reversal where Chinese scientists who once contributed their efforts to innovation here in the United States are being recruited back to China. So this is a real own goal for the United States. And if the gold card or other mechanisms, H-1B, I mean, if they could be strengthened, I think there's a real opportunity here to bring Chinese and others with a lot of talent and assets to invest in the United States. And that's one thing actually that President Trump himself has been open to, even though aspects of his administration documents suggesting a higher degree of scrutiny of Chinese investment. But on television, President Trump said that actually we welcome Chinese money to bring jobs here. So I think that's still very much an open question as to whether this will go in the direction of being more welcoming or more closed.
So what does that do, when you touched on innovation there, if Chinese scientists who are in the United States are either being lured back or for their own reasons, they decide, I can make a pretty good living in China. There are some fantastic technology companies or science companies that want to hire me there.
And I mean, this in some ways is like history potentially repeating itself, where, in the early days of the Cold War, a Chinese rocket scientist who helped, in founding that here in the United States, then couldn't, continue to be employed here, went back to China and founded their kind of rocket program, which is, today, one of the world leaders. So, this is a real challenge, both in numbers, but also in terms of the quality of the individuals who are leaving. And really, this has to do with, scientific investment, federal investment in research and development, where China is spending, an order of magnitude more in this area than the United States right now, which is going in the other direction. And cuts to whether it's the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health, the tax on universities, and the overhead and questions around how much longer universities can continue to be what they have been, which is really the envy of the world and a magnet for international talent. This is all, I think, going very much potentially in the wrong direction to the benefit of China or other countries I mentioned in Europe that are already putting together programs to attract the scientists who are fearing for their careers here in the United States.
Is China using this opportunity to try to elevate its position on the world stage from kind of just a foreign or a military might?
So China certainly, I think, wants to play a greater role in leading. But what that leadership looks like, I think, is very much a work in progress. So far, they've been pretty opportunistic and symbolic in the ways that they've hoped to lead, being willing to set the table for diplomatic discussions, but not necessarily playing a driving role in kind of twisting arms to bring warring parties to the table. I think that their aspirations for Taiwan really haven't changed, although I think that many think that there's a greater deal of impatience given China's growing capabilities. But also, I think, given trends on the island and in the U.S. unofficial relationship with Taiwan, have also, I think, provoked a degree of concern and even pessimism about, how that situation is unraveling. And so I don't see, again, kind of a precipitous move here. I think China's actually been kind of, wanting to, again, establish itself as a legitimate and central player on the world stage, not be kind of relegated to the margins. Certainly, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't want democracy to be seen as the inevitable trajectory of countries around the world, right? That's very much threatening to the continuation of their rule. And so, as the kind of one of the remaining communist parties in the world that's in a position of leadership, China is very concerned about going that way. So I think a lot of the effort that they've made to step up on the world stage is to be seen as central rather than peripheral. But again, how much have they been willing to invest in showing that China is a country that can be relied upon or turned to in times of crisis? I think they've been much more selective and strategic in trying to advance their national interests and their objectives of taking or quote unquote reunifying with Taiwan. I don't see that being precipitously changed by changes in the United States so long as U.S. policy toward Taiwan and China remains on a more or less even keel. So far, the president has, declined to change U.S. policy toward Taiwan, which I think is wise. But we shall see what happens in the days and months to come.
One of the stories in the past few weeks has been the United States deciding to cut off, Radio Free Liberty, Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, and so forth, Voice of America, and the sort of other networks. Is that an opportunity for China?
I certainly think that it reduces the set of views that people in Southeast Asia or other parts of the world hear. I think that the bigger effect, though, is to reduce the sense that the United States is championing sort of the cause of democracy against China, and the support that USAID and the National Endowment of Democracy had played in supporting groups that often were quite critical of China holding it to account. To some extent, this is, I think, reassuring to China. In some ways, I think, continues the trend of American leaders realizing that we have a limited ability to shape the trajectory of China's domestic political system. But this is a really a sudden change, I think, that many are still questioning, how this will all play out. I mean, I think Chinese propaganda has not necessarily been all that effective itself. One has to wonder about all of these, state-funded efforts. I think much more important would be a kind of robust and vibrant news media, independent news media that is not funded by governments. So we'll have to watch that space.
Are there concerns about how the president creates this atmosphere, maybe it's hawkishness or aggression towards China, and what the ripple effects are in American democracy to civil liberties? I'm thinking particularly, in the wake of the pandemic, statement after statement that came out of the president's mouth, really, and then we saw a massive increase in anti-Asian hate crimes for a couple of years. What are the ripple effects of the ways the president and the administration frames our relationship with China?
I'm so glad that you raised the question of rhetoric and the attacks on, Asian Americans, because I do think that was a really big sea change after the pandemic, and to some extent, I think we're still living in that world, even though the president himself has actually pivoted in terms of his rhetoric, talking about wanting a constructive and positive relationship with Xi Jinping, saying a fair number of nice things about him. But I think that the tone that earlier period set still remains very much alive on Capitol Hill. We have bills, suggesting the expulsion of Chinese students from the United States. We have legislation that would really treat all Chinese investment or commerce as potentially suspect, especially academic exchange. And I think that is really damaging, because the United States has really thrived on being a place where people of different nationalities and from different countries can actively participate. And it's we're an open economy, and I think the more that we move to a closed one, the more that companies of all nationalities wonder about coming and investing in the United States. It's not just even, I think, affecting Asian Americans now. We have tourism to the United States is down. We have people being turned away at the border or harassed that aren't of Asian extraction. And so I think this is all very much calling into question the future of the United States as an open and welcoming society, which has really fueled, I think, our leadership for so many decades.
Jessica Chen Weiss, Director of the Institute for America, China, and the Future of Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins University. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Well, now the U.S. is facing one of its worst measles outbreaks in decades, which last week claimed the life of a second child. The Department of Health and Human Services is working with local officials to combat the outbreak. And now this comes as the Trump administration is slashing thousands of jobs and billions in grants to state and local health departments. Tom Frieden led the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention for over a decade, and he warns Hari Srinivasan that these cuts threaten lives, not just in America, but all over the world.
Beyond, thanks, Dr. Tom Frieden. Thanks so much for joining us. Last week, the HHS announced that it is beginning a significant round of layoffs and force reductions. 10,000 to 20,000 people are going to be downsized. What was your reaction when you heard the news?
Unfortunately, this is targeting the wrong number. It's an arbitrary reduction in jobs. The goal should be a reduction in preventable suffering, illness, injury, and death. That's what we should be focused on when we're trying to improve health and make America healthier.
So you wrote a column recently, and the title was "Cuts to the Agency Will Cost American Lives and Dollars." Explain that. Why is this life or death?
Traditionally, for decades, the CDC has protected Americans from threats, whether those are infectious or otherwise, man-made or natural, from the US or anywhere in the world. If you look at those three areas that threats come from, two of them are being undermined by recent actions. One of them is non-infectious threats, which are very real. The chronic disease crisis is indeed a crisis, and there are things we can do about it. And if you look at the cuts to the global health programs, they're devastating. If not reversed, they will cause millions of deaths around the world and make Americans less safe.
People might recognize your face. You used to run the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Kind of put this in perspective for us. I mean, where the CDC sits, what it's responsible for, where the HHS sits, what it's responsible for.
This is unprecedented, Harry. Nothing like this has ever happened before. What we're looking at is reversing decades of progress in public health. Let me give you three examples. First, smoking. The CDC Office on Smoking and Health has made tremendous progress. We've reduced adult smoking to the lowest level ever. Smoking in kids is less than 4% now. It used to be 28%. These are programs that were working, and overnight, they've been ended. And that means the laboratory work, the disease tracking, the support for state programs. There are many state programs that rely for most of their money for tobacco control on the CDC. This includes Kansas, West Virginia, Michigan, and others. So tobacco is one big area. A second is environmental health risks. The whole unit that tracks environmental health risks, whether that's asthma or soot called PM 2.5 or harmful algal blooms, a big issue in Florida, that whole unit was ended from one day to the next. The third area is communication. Americans rely on the CDC for fact-based information. Doctors rely on the CDC for medical guidance. All of the CDC communications programs were ended. I have no idea how they're going to update their website or live stream programs or run what's called CDC Info, where they answer questions from the public. This really does undermine health and safety of the U.S.
You know, there's a story in the Washington Post which said that employees who were laid off worked on measures to, quote, prevent drowning, gun violence, and smoking. Scientists researched asthma, climate change, and worker safety. Now, these programs, should they be under the Centers for Disease Control?
Well, first off, it's really important to understand that when funds go to CDC, about 2/3 of all of those funds go out to state and local health departments and some to community organizations to confront those problems in communities. So when you cut the budget for CDC, you're actually cutting state and local programs. And when you cut the number of staff working at CDC, you're undermining the ability of CDC to both increase the effectiveness of those programs and to support state and local governments.
Robert F. Kennedy has said that, Jr., has said that this overhaul is necessary. He put it out on social media recently, quote, "The reality is clear. What we've been doing isn't working. Despite spending $1.9 trillion in annual costs, Americans are getting sicker every year. In the past 4 years alone, the agency's budget has grown by 38%, yet outcomes continue to decline." What's wrong with his line of thinking?
There are elements of what Secretary Kennedy says that I completely agree with. We do have a chronic disease crisis. We must address it. What we've learned in public health is when we focus on things, we can see big progress. Look at HIV. With HIV, we have a 90% reduction in deaths and a 75% reduction in infections because of public health programs. When you eliminate those programs, you get rid of labs that track things like hepatitis and STDs. You eliminate tracking systems for behavioral risks. You're really putting Americans at risk.
There seems to be a focus on chronic disease from the part of the cabinet secretary. Where are we in terms of the work that HHS and CDC do in preventing those?
The big picture about chronic disease is there is no mystery about it. There are 5 things that are driving most chronic disease in America: tobacco, salt, sugar, soot, called PM 2.5, and alcohol. The difference between addressing infectious diseases and addressing chronic diseases is that infectious diseases don't hire lobbyists. The tobacco industry has been trying to get rid of the CDC program for decades. The current administration accomplished that in weeks. A second area that's really challenging is improving nutrition. This means improving the choices that Americans have in the supermarket, in restaurants, so that the healthier foods are less expensive, more accessible. Right now, the Agriculture Department spends billions of dollars to subsidize unhealthy food that's sold cheaply to Americans.
When you think about chronic diseases, I mean, the data doesn't seem to back up our current way of doing things, right? I mean, early onset cancer increased by 79% between 1990 and 2019 around the world. If medical problems like this seem to be persisting, why should we not shift course, as Cabinet Secretary Kennedy says?
We know what to do about chronic disease. Tax tobacco, tax alcohol, tax soda, tax junk food. This makes a really big difference. If you can't do that, at least don't subsidize junk food and unhealthy food. Make healthy food cheaper, more available. It's also critically important that we improve our primary healthcare system. Here's a shocking fact. Less than 5% of all of the funds that Medicare provides goes to primary care. Primary care is your local doctor, your family clinician. That is very, very cost-effective care. In fact, the best evidence is that if we do it right, we could triple spending on primary care and reduce overall Medicare spending. And in fact, primary care is not available for about 100 million Americans don't have a local doctor. So yes, we do need improvements. We need better primary health care. And frankly, we need more investment in some of the leading causes of illness, injury, disability, and death. 20 years ago, I wrote an article called Asleep at the Switch, that we are asleep at the switch from infectious to non-infectious causes of death. But when we invest, we see big improvements.
I wonder, when you talk about infectious diseases, I mean, I was reading a paper last week by McClure and Gandhi at UCSF, and it said that we are likely to see more drug-resistant cases of tuberculosis and HIV spread in the world. This is kind of what happens after periods of war or economic collapse, and that's what these two researchers were kind of making this parallel to, our withdrawal from U.S. aid or in some of the preventative issues with under both these departments.
The chaotic U.S. withdrawal from global health is going to have terrible consequences, not only on the health of children, mothers, and adults around the world, but also on American health. Drug-resistant tuberculosis is an important example. When you stop a TB treatment program, when you disrupt it with messing up supply chains, with stopping funding of organizations providing care. To give you one example, an excellent organization in Bangladesh had thousands of workers helping tuberculosis patients get through treatment. They were laid off. Hundreds of thousands of health workers in Africa have been laid off because of these very drastic, chaotic, and unplanned cuts. This is really bad for the world, and it's bad for the U.S. also. A single case of drug-resistant tuberculosis can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars or even $1 million to care for in the U.S., and yet preventing that overseas could cost less than $100.
How do we get over what has become a structural mistrust in the institutions within our government regarding health, right? There was an Ipsos Axis poll, March of 2020, before the pandemic, or at the beginning, 85% of Americans, regardless of party identification, trusted the CDC. By August of 2024, only 49% of Republicans and 59% of independents did, compared with 88% of Democrats. It becomes an incredibly partisan split. What do you think accounts for this kind of lack of trust, and what do we do to try to rebuild it?
This isn't easy to rebuild, and I think both administrations bear some of the blame for this, frankly. In the Biden administration, the CDC was required to speak as part of the White House. And that's a problem, because if they're connected with politicians, then people who don't like those politicians aren't going to like the advice that CDC gives. Unfortunately, trust is only built very gradually and can be destroyed in a moment. What CDC and public health need to do is listen, address what people are concerned about, have small wins, and stay away from mandates. Not popular, not effective, and for most things, not necessary. The few things that are necessary, shutting a local restaurant that's spreading typhoid or salmonella, that's something that people can understand.
Speaking of things that are infectious diseases that are affecting populations today, just over the weekend, a second child in Texas died from a measles outbreak there. In an op-ed, Secretary Kennedy has promoted vaccines, but he's also pursued remedies like vitamin A and cod liver oil. And I wonder, given what you've said about sort of communications and messaging, do you see something wrong with that approach?
There are really big problems with the U.S. response to measles. Just to be clear, this is the second largest outbreak we've had in the last 25 years, and as many deaths as we've had in the last 25 years combined in the U.S. The measles vaccine is safe and effective. Measles virus is dangerous, and as we've seen, it can be deadly, even for healthy children. Vitamin A, actually, by chance, I did the studies on vitamin A when there was a big outbreak in New York City in the early 1990s. Vitamin A may have a role not to prevent measles or before you have measles, but for young children who have measles, a very controlled dose of vitamin A might be able to slightly reduce the severity of illness. That's it for vitamin A. And if you take too much, it can be quite toxic. So these are not just toxic potential medicines, but toxic advice. The way you stop a measles outbreak is by vaccinating, providing it to people, answering their questions, being clear the measles vaccine is safe and effective.
Is Robert Kennedy Jr., the cabinet secretary, misinterpreting your data about the vitamin A studies?
Anyone who says that giving vitamin A prevents measles or should be given before a measles infection is saying something that's not supported by any scientific facts.
Recently, we had Dr. Peter Marks, the top vaccine chief. He left the position at the FDA because of disagreements with the cabinet secretary. He told the Wall Street Journal that Kennedy sought non-existent data to justify anti-vax narratives. So what do you see here if the person who's running the agency in charge of Health and Human Services is promoting mis or disinformation?
I'm worried. And I'm worried about things like the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, where Mr. Kennedy has spread inaccurate statements. He said 97% of them have severe conflicts of interest. That is simply not true. And in fact, what CDC has done is put on the website every potential conflict of interest in every member of the advisory committee. These are parents, pediatricians, public health specialists who volunteer their time. And this group, what's called the ACIP, is what gives doctors the recommendations for which vaccines to give and what requires insurers to pay for these vaccines, whether they're for COVID or meningitis. So messing up our infrastructure to use facts to protect people from microbes is a very dangerous road to go down.
So what's the problem with saying that perhaps these functions can be done by other departments, other agencies, and this is a way that we could cut costs?
There's a move to create a centralized unit in the federal government, and actually Congress has outlined some interest in looking at that. Until you see what actually would be done and how, it's hard to say whether it's a good or bad idea. Certainly doing things in an unplanned way, getting rid of thousands of people who spent decades of their lives learning how to protect Americans, that's a bad idea. And it's not a recipe for success. And communication is so very important. Who's going to trust a political appointee to give information when the taxpayers are paying the world's top experts in microbes, in environmental toxins, in prevention of stroke and heart attack and treatment of diabetes. That's who we need to be hearing from, and that's what we need to be strengthening. We can reverse the chronic disease epidemic in this country, but that means better primary health care with a focus on controlling high blood pressure and implementing the programs that work while we figure out what's causing some of the increases, for example, of cancer in young people, which is most likely a result of some environmental contaminations, whether it's microplastics or nanoparticles or endocrine disruptors. All of those things were studied by the CDC unit that got axed last week.
One of the sections that we see here that's being significantly impacted is the NIH and the grants that usually go through NIH for researchers around the country and really sometimes around the world. Put this in perspective for us, right? If somebody understands that, okay, the government is interested in trying to prevent chronic disease, is trying to get me healthier from the get-go, if that's what the cabinet secretary says, should we be investing in research that might not bear fruit for years or possibly even decades?
In my view, what we need to do is implement what's proven, and for the things that aren't proven, study them to figure out what works. There's a lot that's proven to reduce chronic disease. Tobacco, alcohol, junk food. We have proven mechanisms of reducing the consumption of those harmful substances. Soot, PM 2.5, there are proven ways of reducing exposure. We don't need studies on whether that's a problem. We may need research to figure out how to best implement programs like that. There are other things like cancer in young people, which are increasing, and we need to understand why that's happening so we can confront it.
Make the case for how interconnected global health is to American health, because some of the pushback that people have been seeing recently is, okay, you know what? I don't necessarily know if I should be spending taxpayer money on preventing tuberculosis in a different country or HIV in a different country. What does that have to do with American health here?
Viruses don't need passports. Viruses don't obey borders. And when a disease emerges anywhere in the world, it may be a threat not just there, but to the US as well. It's faster, it's more efficient, and it's more effective to stop health threats when and where they emerge than to wait till they've spread and gained momentum and are now spreading within the United States.
Former director of the CDC, Tom Frieden, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Hari.
Now, along with this new war in the Middle East, President Trump is gearing up for a military parade at home this weekend for the first time in decades. Ostensibly, it's for the Army's 250th birthday, which also happens to fall on Trump's birthday. He first got a taste for military parades back in 1.0 when President Macron had invited him to view the Bastille Day pomp and circumstance down the Champs-Élysées. Trump came back home wanting to stage such a thing in the United States. But many are skeptical, even some Republicans, about the cost and the optics, especially since Trump sent the National Guard and Marines to California against that state's wishes. Retired four-star General Stanley McChrystal has a deep understanding of U.S. military culture, and he's written a new book called On Character. He spoke with Walter Isaacson just before Israel's strikes on Iran.
Thank you, Christian and General Stan McChrystal. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Walter.
This book, On Character, you say that character is a choice we have. How so?
Well, if you think about it, character, as I try to describe it in the book, is a combination of your deeply held convictions, the things you believe in, the things you'll live to or die for, and the discipline you have to actually live up to them. So you can have all these highfalutin convictions, but if you don't have the discipline to adhere to them, they're meaningless. So I think it's a choice. We first get to decide what we think about enough to adopt as our beliefs, but then we also get to decide how we behave. Now, we sometimes struggle, and most of us fall short on a pretty constant basis, but we get to pick ourselves up every day and try to do better the next day.
You talk about it being conviction and discipline. I know a lot of people with conviction, and sometimes they're disciplined, but I worry about them. They don't have a moral compass. Isn't that part of the equation?
Yeah, I put that in convictions because I think you actually can have character, and it can be bad character. We typically describe character as good. If you were to say Walter Isaacson as character, that would be viewed as positive. But the reality is some people have evil convictions. They have beliefs that are antithetical to what I believe or a total lack of values, but they've got all the discipline in the world to follow those things. Take it, for example, someone who is a complete opportunist. All they're out for is themselves, but they do it in a very disciplined fashion. They don't deviate from it, and they're constantly at it. We may find them despicable, but we find them sometimes effective at what they're trying to do.
I just saw Good Night and Good Luck, the play about Edward R. Murrow, and he's sort of the hero of the play, but the real hero is the Army and the Army McCarthy hearings. And I think it's Joseph Welch who says, "Have you no shame, have you no decency?" Where the Army finally pushed back. It was a period that was eerily like today. Does it have resonance for you and what the military should be thinking now?
It does. And I go back to remember the McCarthy era lasted for longer than we like to pretend it did. He actually had a pretty long run of doing a lot of damage. And it finally took this set of hearings when I think people had sort of had it up to here with him. And then this official from the Army basically uses that great line. But the reality is, it's hard to do that. And so I wish right now somebody would stand up. I wish somebody would say, we are doing things with and to our Army that I think are potentially very, very damaging for a long time.
Are you referring to perhaps the deployment, it's Marines, but the deployment of both the National Guard and Marines for domestic purposes now in Los Angeles this week?
Well, that particular action appears to be lawful, although I don't think it was warranted. But I'm not on the ground, so it's harder for me to judge. What I'm more concerned about is policies inside, for example, Department of Defense, where senior officers were removed for political reasons, for the fact that they had supported diversity, for the fact that they had followed the things which were the policy of their service or their job when they were doing it. And so when you start to remove, you can always fire generals. There is nothing wrong with firing generals for ineffectiveness or any other shortcoming. But if you fire them for political ideology, then I think we are sending a dangerous message across the force.
When you fire them for political ideology, yes, it's a dangerous message across the force, but isn't it a step in some ways to an autocracy or something in which the president or whoever is in charge of doing that takes a certain power that we've not seen before in our society?
Well, Walter, it certainly looks like that. It looks like the effect, remember, of firing a few, or in the case back of during the Soviet Empire, arresting a few people, certainly brings everybody else into line. We didn't have arrests here, obviously, but when you remove a certain number of people and you show that anyone is vulnerable to that, people who have jobs, positions that they have worked a long time to get are likely to shape their behavior, to fall into line more easily. And I think that we see that in the Senate. Think we see the threats that people will put money to your primary opponent, or they will do other things that will cause you not to be reelected. The same occurs in a different way to people in uniform. And so I think we've got to pay close attention that the sacred relationship that the U.S. military has had with our civilian government and our society. And I say sacred because it's not been perfect, but it's been largely apolitical. It's been pretty professional in the sense that the military focused on that which the military should do, completely respected the Constitution and the civilian leaders appointed over them, and then did not act as any kind of a negative influence on our population, didn't police our population or was perceived as a threat.
So you think it's dangerous that they are now policing our population?
I don't think it's a good idea, because if you think about it, pretty quickly, if they become an easy tool to use, then the ability to control our population, it really runs pretty counter against what people who are strong believers in the Second Amendment believe strongly in. to have the actual U.S. military out on streets should be very upsetting to the National Rifle Association.
When you talk about generals being fired for political purposes, and it started with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, it raises that question of, I've always thought the military's first loyalty was to the Constitution. But it makes it so now they have to be loyal to the political leader in power, in this case, President Trump.
Yeah. And let me make sure I nuance this correctly. Leaders should be loyal to their bosses. They should follow lawful orders. They should not do things that are disloyal behind their backs. But at the same time, the ultimate loyalty is to the Constitution. The assumption has always been that the president is a representative. He is a chief executive that represents the values of the Constitution and the limits therein. And so there was no danger in being very loyal to the commander-in-chief because that was, in fact, being loyal to the Constitution. When those diverge in any way, then I think you have great danger. Many people will know that in 1936 in Germany, the Wehrmacht changed the oath of their allegiance from the Constitution to the Führer. And so whenever you personalize ultimate loyalty, I think you have the danger because, you know, you're not quite sure what kind of leader you're going to have wielding that power.
You begin your book with the incident in which you were having, some time with the Rolling Stone reporter. You were speaking off the cuff, maybe off the record, and you said some things about President Obama, Vice President Biden that weren't as respectful. And then when it hit the print, you go into the White House and you offer your resignation. You say in this book that you've chewed on that over and over again. Tell me what lessons on character you learned from that.
Yeah, and Walter, I hate to recorrect the story, but the story was one that I thought was not accurate, and it didn't depict me as saying those things, but it doesn't matter. A negative story came out in the Rolling Stone, and I was the commander, so I was responsible for the fact that my boss, the commander-in-chief, gets this explosive story on his desk. And so I thought it was my responsibility to offer my resignation. That was not a hard decision. It was a painful decision, but it wasn't hard because I knew that I was responsible. I should accept that responsibility. So I flew back to the United States, met with President Obama, who was gracious. And I offered him my resignation, and he accepted it. When I say that I chewed over it later, I have never second-guessed the decision to resign. I am convinced from the moment the story came out that was required, and I've been convinced ever since it was the right and only right answer. Now, what I have thought about is sort of what if? What if the story had never come out? What if life had been different? What if we had not had that reporter around at all? And then, what if I had responded differently to the experience? Because in reality, the most important moment of my life, in retrospect, is the moment after the president accepted my resignation, and my wife, Annie, who you know, said, we're going to face forward. I said I had resigned and he'd accepted it, and she says, good. We've always been happy. We'll always be happy. And she was signaling that we weren't going to go back and relitigate the past. I wasn't going to be a bitter general who gets invited out to lunch just so people can hear a story, because nobody cares. Instead, what I decided to do was try to live my life going forward in a manner that those people who had never met me, but had heard about the story, would say, wow, that doesn't seem like what I heard about in that story. Or people who had known me and had committed themselves, in many cases, to serve with me, decided they weren't wrong, that the person they'd always believed in was the real person. And I had to prove that every day, and I'm still doing that. I'm 70 years old, it's 15 years on, and there are days when it's hard, but it's never been the wrong decision for me.
There's a part of the book that really struck me as being very honest, and it's about faith. You have a chapter on faith, and you do it throughout the book. And let me read you some of it, which is, for most of my life, I've believed in God. I am now less sure than I once was, but the habit of accepting the concept I was taught as a child is strong enough that I reflexively accept the idea of a deity. When it comes to character, is it good to have doubts and to question things, or is it important to have just faith?
I think it's very important to have doubts. Faith scares me a bit because one definition of faith says to believe in something you can't prove. And the problem is there are a whole bunch of things out there that I shouldn't believe in that I could, that I can't prove because they're not true. And so I think faith, it's comforting in some ways, and that's why I almost envy people who have this complete faith. But I actually think it's more important to question everything. It's more important to search ourselves, to search our values, to search what we hear, to doubt the things that are put in front of us, because only when we pressure test them do I think we really come out with the closest to an accurate appraisal of whether it's right for us.
The name Donald Trump doesn't appear in this book as far as I can remember reading it, and yet every question of character goes to the heart of what people either feel good or bad about him. You endorsed his opponent. Was that partly on character grounds?
It was entirely on character grounds. In fact, I didn't agree with many of the Democratic Party's positions. I didn't agree with all the Republican Party positions. I'm really very much in the center. But when I looked at the character of the two candidates, I had enough data because one had been vice president, one had been president already. I made the judgment that the character of the vice president was better. And I think that you really don't know what a president's going to have to face. There are a lot of unexpected things that arise. So I don't want to elect somebody based upon their position on taxes or tariffs or this, because a lot of that will change. And what I really need the president to be is a moral leader for the country. And I assess that Vice President Harris would do that better than her opponent.
Was there any particular thing about the current president in terms of the honesty or the commitment that particularly struck you?
You know, I think we have a big body of knowledge about the president. And I don't think he is the cause of our problems. If you get up in the morning and you resent the president for the way things are, I think that's misplaced. He is a symptom. He is a symptom of an erosion of character in our country. We, as people, allowed that character to erode for lots of reasons. And then we make choices.
Wait, why? Why do you think we let that erode?
Well, I think we become bewitched by celebrity, fascinated by wealth. We are captivated by the fact that somebody comes out and says, we can get things done. You know, we're going to do this. And that becomes expedient. I use the example sometimes of if you live next door to the Sopranos or to Vito Corleone and your daughter gets treated badly by someone, you can go next door and you can get it fixed. You don't have to go through the legal system or that. And there's a certain amount of selectiveness to that idea that, okay, we're just going to cut to the chase and we're going to go get justice. But we understand societies can't work that way because the same person who can do that does all of these other things that make our society weaker. So we as Americans don't demand character. We have decided to accept less. We have this strange situation now where a politician will come on TV, they will look in the camera, and they will say something they know is untrue. And the funny thing is they know you know it's untrue. But we have this agreement where because they're politicians, we say, well, they have to lie because that's their position. And we have to, no, we don't have to accept it. We don't at all have to accept it. We could say no. And yet we have allowed ourselves to accept that's the way things are. And I think that is a great danger to us.
Tomorrow, Saturday, is the 250th anniversary of your beloved institution, the U.S. Army. General Washington helped create it back then 250 years ago. it's being celebrated or feted in Washington by a parade that I think it has, M1 tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles, 7,000 soldiers marching. And in some ways, it reminds me of, I actually saw some of those military parades in Moscow when I was a young correspondent. Do you think that's an appropriate way to be celebrating?
I think there's a better way. First, if I was going to celebrate the United States Army, I wouldn't have any tanks, any helicopters, any missiles, because any dictator around the world can buy those things. I would have just American soldiers, because only America can field American soldiers. That's our crown jewel. That's what we should be proud of. That's what we should be cheering. They don't do as much damage to the streets as well. But the reality is, if we want to focus on the 250th anniversary of the Army, and I think that's great, let's put those soldiers out and let's celebrate their values. Let's celebrate their sacrifice. Let's celebrate their heroism. Let's focus on that. And if we do that, then I think it could be a tremendous reinforcement for the fact that that force is a mirror of our society. We should be proud of it, and they should be comforted by the fact that we believe in them.
General Stan McChrystal, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Walter.
Now, William F. Buckley Jr. is widely known as one of the architects behind modern conservatism in America. As a prominent right-wing commentator and writer, he was a close political ally and friend of President Reagan, and would often feature Reagan on his show, Firing Line. Over the course of nearly 3 decades, author Sam Tannenhouse has been crafting the intellectual's biography titled Buckley, The Life and the Revolution That Changed America. And he joins Walter Isaacson to discuss how Buckley's legacy fits into today's politics.
Thank you, Biana. And Sam Tannenhouse, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's great to be here, Walter. Thanks.
So William F. Buckley, is he the founder of modern day populist conservatism that we now see, or would he be appalled by it?
Both. He is a founder of the conservatism we see now. Notice I say a founder. He didn't do it alone. But I think he might be a little dismayed by how it looks and sounds now. And by that, Walter, I mean, you knew Bill Buckley, and he was very much a man of language, arguments, and ideas, rigorous debate where you listen to the other side. I'm not sure he'd be so comfortable with how the politics works today.
But what about the populism, the anti-elitism? There was, of course, a whiff of elitism to William F. Buckley Jr.
Well, there you've captured the paradox of William F. Buckley, because he was himself seemed to be an almost aristocratic patrician. We remember the voice, the style, the language, the books, but he was involved with political figures like Joseph McCarthy. He was very close to him. One of the discoveries I made in uncovering his life, which included many long interviews with him, was how devoted he remained to Joseph McCarthy. Why? Because if you're an elite patrician like Bill Buckley, and you don't just want to be heard, you want to win the battle, which increasingly looked like a cultural battle, then politicians like McCarthy might be useful for that.
Well, you got Joe McCarthy. You also have Roy Cohn, who's, of course, a pugnacious lawyer. Two people you would have thought would have repelled Buckley. Why did he remain loyal to them to the end?
Walter, one of the aspects of the conservative movement that even now we have trouble wrapping our minds around was how much it was against rather than for. So in the famous book Bill Buckley wrote with his brother-in-law, McCarthy and His Enemies, published at the very peak of the McCarthy controversy in 1954, there's not a great deal about Joe McCarthy. There's a lot about his enemies. And Roy Cohn, Joe McCarthy, and others, they included Rush Limbaugh, whom Buckley sponsored in the 1990s, were on the same side in that cultural battle.
But the through line is that they're strongly anti-communist. And of course, Buckley is very strong. It's almost his animating force. Does some of that come from his father, William F. Buckley Sr.?
His father was from the south of Texas, Both Buckley's parents are from the South. His mother was from New Orleans. And they raised their children to believe that all the New Deal was a counter-revolutionary event catastrophe in America. But earlier still, Buckley's father, who made his first fortune in Mexican oil, lost it during the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920. And Buckley Sr., William F. Buckley Sr., was convinced it was a Bolshevist plot. Those were his words, that carried all the way through into American politics in the 1930s. And then at the time of World War II, when the great debate over intervention began, Bill Buckley, the young Bill Buckley's first cause as a teenager.
You've talked about Alois Steiner, his mother from New Orleans, and William F. Buckley Sr. Both are very Catholic, but an interesting type of Catholic because they're in places where the Catholics are to some extent the elite rather than the outsiders. Did that inform the younger Buckley's Catholicism?
It did very much. One of the amusing lines that runs through the Buckley family's life is they were always competitive with the Kennedys. These two very wealthy, attractive families of New England, Irish Catholics, and there were differences. Bill Buckley had some funny lines about the Kennedys. He said, I don't know why people keep comparing us with the Kennedys. Joseph Kennedy Sr. was devoted to Ireland. The first time my father set foot in Ireland was to go to the Dublin Horse Show in 1939. They pulled a kind of class rank on the Kennedys, which was very amusing once Jack Kennedy was elected president, because now you have these two powerful families in opposition who came up from the same roots.
You do a good analysis of God and Man at Yale, his first book, when he comes out of Yale. I remember reading that book and I couldn't figure out, is he a product of Yale or a rebel against Yale?
He's both. That's the genius of it. Walter, many people have been attacking the Ivy League. You're an Ivy League man. And you know, from the 1930s, if not earlier, there were attacks on the Ivy League, from Congress people in HUAC, the House Committee on Un-American Activities, from a populist journalist, some of the attacks we see now. What set Buckley apart was he was the biggest man on campus in his year, the year he graduated in 1950. He was tapped, as I said, for all the clubs. He was the last man tapped for Skull and Bones, the highest accolade you could achieve. He was voted into all the best fraternities. He was famous for his work on the Yale Daily News. It's possible to argue William F. Buckley Jr. was the greatest campus journalist of the 20th century. He became famous while he was still at Yale writing editorials. So all of that made Bill Buckley. And then he climbed up on that platform he'd built for himself and denounced his professors for being too left-wing in economics and for being atheists. And the key to the book was not only that he named names in it, a book published at the peak of the McCarthyism, 1951. He had two solutions to the problem. One is that alumni should step in and fire the faculty they didn't like. And the second was that donors should stop contributing to fund drives. And in 1951, all the people around him, including mentors and friends, close associates, said, Bill, do not write that ridiculous last chapter. But Buckley knew that's where he would touch the nerve. And lo and behold, all these years later, it's not shocking to hear that same approach, if you're familiar with this, to the Ivy League universities today, only they're coming from the president himself.
One of the things I found really disconcerting in the book and surprised me because he's such a genteel man was not only that he was a segregationist, but there was a racism that carries through what he does. In 1957, the National Review, I'm going to quote you some, had an editorial entitled, Why the South Must Prevail. He said, white communities in the South the white community in the South is entitled to take such measures as are necessary to prevail politically and culturally in areas where it does not predominate numerically because for the time being, it is the advanced race. And even after the 64 Civil Rights Act, there was something in the National Review he did, Negroes, Intelligence, and Prejudice, and he argued for separate education.
He did. He did. All the way up and through until the late 1960s, when something happened to him, he actually got to know some very charismatic and persuasive Black leaders, including the very young Jesse Jackson, whom one of the advantages, one of the great things about Bill Buckley was he was open to the argument and the new idea. If you could beat him in debate, or even if he won, he still wanted to hear what you had to say. Early in that earlier period you're talking about, and viewers should understand, when that editorial was written in 1957, that was at the moment that the first modern Civil Rights Act was being deliberated on in Congress, the one that Lyndon Johnson and Senator Richard Russell tangled over and was signed under Eisenhower. And what was missing from that bill, as you know very well, was the protection of voting rights. And Robert Caro, in that wonderful book, The Master of the Senate, walks us through all the steps. Buckley and company really believed Black people did not deserve to vote. And he continued saying this for many years without apology. A surprise for me, Walter, is that people were less shocked to hear that than you might expect them to be. You would think that a great liberal like Arthur Schlesinger would be appalled by that. No, he would just say, well, Buckley's in with the segregationists on that, and move on to the next point. It is not to justify or excuse it, but to show you in that climate, Buckley could make assertions like that and not seem a disreputable person.
So we've established that he was pretty much not just a segregationist, but somewhat racist. He's very anti-communist, supports Joe McCarthy. He's also isolationist with Charles Lindbergh against intervention in World War II, even anti-Semitic in some ways. And yet he's known for trying to purge the conservative movement of its extremists, bigots, kooks, anti-Semites, and racists. How do you square that?
Well, for one thing, he learned. He actually grew. And the Buckley of age 40 is not the same as the Buckley of age 30. One important thing that happened was a mayoral campaign he was involved in. In some ways, it was the greatest thing he ever did. It really helped transform politics when, on the conservative line that he created, a conservative party he created in New York in 1965, he challenged the liberal Republican John Lindsay, a congressman who decided to run for mayor, and a clubhouse Democrat from Brooklyn, Abe Beame. Buckley ran as the conservative. Nowadays, we would say he ran as the base candidate against the rhino, who would be John Lindsay. And what happened was Buckley was a listener and observer, and he loved meeting people. And as he went out on the campaign trail, he began to meet all kinds of people, including Black voters. And he realized, no, you can't put them all in a block and assume they're going to vote one way, which was the basis, the justification for those early racist editorials. No, you have to take them on as individuals. After all, Bill Buckley is a big supporter of individualism. So that means you cannot make assumptions about anyone. And with his television program Firing Line, he wanted to have lively debate. So I'll suggest to viewers, go on YouTube and watch Bill Buckley's conversation with Muhammad Ali in 1967, when Ali was stripped of his heavyweight crown and threatened with imprisonment because he wouldn't serve in the Vietnam War. And you hear Buckley very respectfully engaging with Muhammad Ali, not about whether Ali was right to do that. He respected the courage Ali had shown. No, they debate Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, because Buckley found himself defending Malcolm X against Muhammad Ali.
He also had Eldridge Cleaver, then over to his apartment. He's a very social person when this happens.
That's right. No, and Buckley didn't agree with a word of it. He would ridicule them in columns and print, and then he'd say, Eldridge, you want to have a drink? Come over to the house, to the Maisonette and Park Avenue, and we'll have a drink, and bring your friend Timothy Leary, the LSD experimenter. That's how Buckley lived.
He wrote 50 books. He wrote 3 columns a week. He launched the show Firing Line. He did a whole lot. But in your book, there's an implicit question, almost a criticism, which is he was always on the surface in a way, doing so many things. One of the lines you used to explain this way he did things, just dashing off columns in the back of a car, dashing off books that were hardly edited, is that he didn't go deep because he was enjoying himself too much. I think those are your words. What did you mean by that?
In a time, it was the great columnist George Will, who was one of many proteges of Bill Buckley, whom I discussed this with. What George suggested was, in these terrible years of Watergate, Vietnam, the Nixon years, which you know so much about, and all the strife and polarization, similar to what we're feeling today, Buckley was going to live out what he called the conservative demonstration. That was a term he came up with when he was quite young. That is to say, if you read or listened to Bill Buckley, saw him on the move, heard his voice, was brought into his world, heard his conversation, that would make you more open to the arguments he had to make, rather than presenting a really complex, beautifully argued, philosophical treatise very few people are going to read. He was a man in the public world. He became famous when he was in his 20s. He imagined himself facing large audiences, and he often did. Thousands of students would show up to hear him lecture. In the early 60s, that's how much a celebrity he was. And he thought if he could reach young people and help them think, argue, maybe one of them would become the thinker and prophet that he knew he didn't have it in himself to be. So in the end, I saw that as kind of a generous self-assessment, which more of us could stand to make, probably.
So in some ways, you call him a performing ideologue, a performative, and that phrase, people pick that up from your book. How does that relate to today, where so many people who are ideologues on both sides are simply doing it in 140 characters in a performative way? Is that what he was doing?
You know, I'm asked, what would WFB, William F. Buckley Jr., have done on Twitter? And I said, he just would have burned it up. He would have had more tweets out there than Donald Trump and Elon Musk combined. He was so facile, so quick. He loved the one-liner. He's famous for his one-liners. I think in some way he did create that. And one of the effects that his story has had, now that it's being discussed again, is that it makes the whole trajectory of the American conservative movement and conquest look very different. Because now, if you think of the touchstones as being Joseph McCarthy, Ronald Reagan, Bill Buckley, and Donald Trump, what they all have in common? They're masters of the media. They're masters of performance. They don't so much come out of politics as conquer it. They conquer it from the outside. They're cultural figures, and culture and politics intertwined. Buckley was the first to see it. And with that, all our history and our current politics looks very different. We think we give presidents license to do things the Constitution does not allow for. And Buckley seemed to feel that's where things were going. He intuited it. He was a man of perception, with long antenna that picked up where the culture was going.
Sam Tannenhouse, thank you so much for joining us.
What a pleasure.
Now, Minnesota's Somali community is the latest focus of Donald Trump's wrath and war on immigrants. At a rally last night, the president let loose, openly using an epithet he had previously denied using in 2018.
Why is it we only take people from countries, right? Why can't we have some people from Norway, Sweden, just a few? Let us have a few. From Denmark, do you mind sending us a few people? Send us some nice people, do you mind? But we always take people from Somalia, places that are a disaster, right? Filthy, dirty, disgusting, ridden with crime. The only thing they're good at is going after ships.
So this has been described by some as a xenophobic tirade, and it comes amid a crackdown by ICE agents in Minnesota this week, which is home to the largest Somali community in the United States. Democratic State Senator Zainab Mohammed herself immigrated to the U.S. as a child, and she's joining Hari Srinivasan.
Christiane, thanks. State Senator Zainab Mohammed, thanks so much for joining us. You are a state senator. You're representing all Minnesotans, but you're also representing from a state that has about 80,000 Somalis. And recently, President Trump, during a news conference, said, quote, "I don't want them in our country. We could go one way or the other, and we're going to go the wrong way if we keep taking in garbage into our country." As not just a state senator and representative, but as a Somali immigrant, what was your reaction to this when you heard this?
I was sad, incredibly sad, but I wasn't shocked coming from what's been happening the last 11 years and seeing the president target our community over the course of his administration. I wasn't shocked. I was really deeply disturbed by it, and sad for my community, for them to deal with the most powerful person in the world, to call them garbage.
Now, there's also, at the same time, been a program conducted by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement called Metro Surge. The White House border czar, Tom Homan, recently, he said, "We also know that there's a large illegal Somali community here and that there's a large illegal alien community there. We're going to arrest every illegal alien that we find there." Can you just help us put in perspective what the percentage numbers of undocumented Somalis are in Minnesota?
Yeah, it's not many. So majority of Somalis in Minnesota are United States citizens, or they're naturalized citizens. They're born here. They're either naturalized citizens, often first, second, or even third generation Americans. We don't have many folks who are undocumented. We have about 700 people across the country who are on temporary status, temporary protected status, TPS, which is they are legal residents, but we don't have many numbers in terms of undocumented communities, folks in Minnesota when it comes to that.
So even in the entire population of Somalis in the country, if there are only about 700, and let's say there's about 400 of those TPS recipients in Minnesota, the president said recently on his social media platform that he was terminating effective immediately the temporary protected status of TPS program for Somalis in Minnesota. I mean, do you think that the administration is going to be successful in this?
I think they will try, but what's clear is they are not going to be successful, because what they think is there are large numbers of Somalis who are undocumented, or majority of our community is on TPS, which is not the case. And that's what they're seeing here on the ground, is that these folks are citizens, they're born here, they're naturalized. Let's say all of them live in Minnesota. 700 out of 80,000 is not that many people. And these are folks who are fleeing war and famine, some of the worst conditions to come to America for safety. And we've granted them that. And he's taken that away. And I think it speaks to his leadership and the fact that it's been detrimental to the American citizens.
Can you tell us about the scale of the operation that you and members of your community have witnessed here?
ICE agents came here in the hundreds last Monday. It's been exactly a week. What we know is that so far they've only detained 19 people. Out of that, only 5 are Somalis. But they are everywhere in our communities. And they're not just targeting undocumented communities. That's what's really important to note here, is that they're targeting United States citizens. They have detained people who were born here. And so what they're doing is they're going up to people, as long as you look like me or you look like an immigrant, they're questioning you, they're stopping you. And so we're teaching people to carry their passport IDs. And I think that's something important to know, because what they wanted was to see large numbers of undocumented Somalis in Minnesota. Turns out there isn't. And so now they're just harassing and being aggressive towards the community.
There was a local news report, I think it's on Fox 9, of a Somali woman who is a U.S. citizen who was arrested by ICE agents while running an errand. Can you tell us a little bit more about her case?
Yeah, so what we know is she was running errands. She's actually born in Edina, Minnesota, raised here, has been here her entire life. She was running errands on a regular day. 2 cars with ICE agents pulled up, zip-tied her. They detained her for 24 hours. And in that process, she told her story to the news that she was sexually assaulted, her family speaking up. And so what they're doing is not operating under the law. They are not here to enforce immigration laws. They're here to be disrespectful to the community, to antagonize them, and to create fear. And they're certainly doing that.
We should note that in this case, DHS told Fox 9 in Minneapolis that it could not comment on the incident without further information. So when you see stories like this on the news or from members of your community, what does that do to the overall kind of, I guess, atmosphere of how the community feels?
Yeah, I mean, just across the state, it doesn't feel normal because in a normal government, local mayors and law enforcement would know what ICE is doing, what why they're there, who they're targeting, for what reason they're arresting people. That is not happening. They are coming here in a hostile invading to try to invade the state of Minnesota, and I think it is really scary. What it is creating for us as like Minnesotans is it is making it clear that these folks are not here to enforce our immigration laws, that these folks are here to scare us, to create us versus them mentality. And so people are uniting and they are protecting their neighbors who are citizens who just happen to be immigrants or from immigration background.
What is your advice when Somali members of your community call you?
Well, I tell them, make sure you carry your passport ID and your passport card because they are not targeting just individuals who are undocumented. They are targeting all of us. I carry my passport ID. I tell my mother to do so. And the calls I get that I'm most afraid for are the mothers who don't speak English well or don't speak it at all, who still have to go to work. Those are the people that worry me the most in terms of interacting with the folks who are trying to invade our state.
This right now has been focused in on the Twin Cities, but Somalis have similarly, just like they left from the downtown to the suburbs, they've also left to exurban and rural areas to work on farms and be parts of small towns. Are you hearing anything from there?
Thank you for pointing that out. We're not just in the Twin Cities. We're not just in the suburbs. We're also in small towns. People in greater Minnesota, whether in Willmar, Moorhead, or central Minnesota, are also vigilant. They are well aware of what's happening in the Twin Cities. Some people in central Minnesota, in St. Cloud, Minnesota, which is a small town in central Minnesota, have seen ICE agents show up. And so it's not just a target in the Twin Cities or in the metro. They are targeting people across the state of Minnesota. Our people have been here for, at this point, first, second, or third generations. They know their neighbors. They are not just people who are entrepreneurs. They are farmers and doctors and lawyers. And so their neighbors know that, and they're protecting them and they're stepping up. And I think for Minnesotans, it is showing us what it means to be a good neighbor. And so I think what the president has done, he's created this community to be so much better than what we even thought it would be.
So what is been the response of leadership throughout the state? I know in the city, the mayor, Jacob Frey, had signed a recent executive order that barred ICE from using any city-owned spaces like parking lots for staging areas. What about the rest of the city and the state?
Well, people are stepping up. Our governor has stepped up and has made it very clear that they are here to invade our state, that they are being hostile towards citizens. Most of our jurisdictions are not complying because they are not even telling them. They're not even interested in complying with them. And I mentioned this earlier, in a normal government, when ICE agents are in town, they talk to local law enforcement and the mayors, and they let them know who they're arresting and why. And that is not happening. They're showing up in the middle of a Monday with just a press announcement, without any heads up to the local government. And so it's been, for our leaders, they are stepping up. They are also helping people understand what their rights are. A number of organizations across the state are also doing trainings for people so that they know what to do if ICE agents do interact with them.
There was a long-running civil war in Somalia that led to the emigration and fleeing of so many people from that country to all over the world, including the United States. What would Somalis be returning to if they were deported, or if they had this temporary protection status of the 700 or so in the country revoked?
Yeah, I mean, the country is still going through an unrest and civil war. There is famine also happening. We know that people are still living in refugee camps. And so for people who live here, like myself, who've been here since I was 8 years old, to go back to a home I haven't known since I was a child just seems antithetical to the beliefs of Americans. These people are Americans. They've been here for a number of generations. They're not going anywhere. And so that's sort of what we've been telling people, because we're not going to send Americans to countries that they've never been to.
Your family story is somewhat emblematic of so many different Somalis who have immigrated here. Why did they come, and what's your family's contribution been like over the generations?
Yeah, my family is the epitome of the American dream, and why so many people in my community immigrate here. We came here when I was 8 years old. My family was obviously wanting to leave the war, and Americans have taken us in. Minnesotans have taken us in, and in return, every single one of my siblings has graduated college, is contributing in their own way. We've got nurses and people who work in different industries. You have people like me who ran for office when I was 24 years old, became the youngest member and one of the first 3 Black women, because it's important to me, not just as a Somali woman, but just simply as an American, that I give back to the people who've had my back, who've given me home. And this is my home.
I wondered, in some of the remarks that the president has made, he's also targeted Ilhan Omar, who you know very well, is a representative in Congress, and she's been the target of his attacks. Are you seeing an increase in any sorts of threats or political violence against you?
Absolutely. Anytime the president spews what he did, as he did last week, and calls the entire community garbage and paints a brush over us, attacks against our leaders like myself increase. We've been getting death threats. People are afraid to go to their stores or to go, or even if they live in parts where there aren't a lot of people who look like us, they're being more vigilant. They don't know what it incites. We also lived through June 14th in Minnesota, where my leader, Speaker Hortman, Minnesota leader of the House, Melissa Hortman, her husband, were assassinated, and my colleague John Hoffman and his wife had an attempted assassination on them, and I was on that list. And so I'm afraid for my community. I'm afraid for myself. But we have no choice but to step up and speak up against the rhetoric and say we deserve to live in a country that is safe, where our leaders don't incite violence against us, because that's exactly what's happening. And, I would have hoped that June 14th was a lesson to our leaders, both sides of the aisle, but it seems not to be.
One of the things that the president has keyed in on, and several conservatives in the state as well have keyed in on, is a series of fraud cases that have been discovered and investigated and prosecuted over the last few years, where there have been different state programs that have been taken advantage of, and a number of Somalis have been indicted and charged with these crimes. And I guess, your reaction to the president's comments on the case. I mean, he says Somalians ripped off that state Minnesota for billions of dollars every year, billions of dollars, and they contribute nothing.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, the contributions of the community speak for themselves, right? In terms of the fraud hurts everyone. Fraud hurts Somali taxpayers and Somali people who are supposed to be receiving these services. What is important is we don't do this to other communities. This year, there was a group of people who were linked to a Russian gang who stole $10 billion, who schemed over $10 billion in fraud. We don't say, is that indicative of the entire Russian community? Because it's not. And these are individuals who are not a representative of our entire community. They are 78 people. They are criminals. And that is how we should be speaking of them. We should not be saying that this is an indicative of the entire community. That is where the rhetoric starts, and where it creates political violence for people who look like myself.
So, Are these issues kind of being colluded in the minds of Minnesotans, or are they keeping them apart? Okay, there's one that we can be against fraud and we can still support Somali communities, or is this, as you say, kind of painting the brush across the entire community?
I mean, right-wing podcasters and social media and Republicans at the federal level, and certainly Minnesota Republicans, have been in lockstep in blaming the entire community for the actions of few. What I will tell you is these folks are people, individuals in our community have spoken up against. Leaders like myself have said those people are criminals. They don't represent a single identity. And so I'm doing my part in getting the correct message across, which is Somali people contribute to this community overwhelmingly. They're in every industry. They are taxpayers. They are also hurt by these criminals. These folks are criminals, and that's how we're labeling them.
I also, I wonder how much of this do you think is connected to what's happening just, I guess, in Minnesota politics? You're entering a re-election year. You're a democratically controlled state. Tim Walz the president is not a fan of him, and vice versa. There's a quote that I want to pull out. Casey Megan, who used to work at the Minnesota AG's office as a fraud investigator, quoted in the New York Times as saying, "There's a perception that forcefully tackling this issue, fraud, might cause political backlash among the Somali community, which is a core voting bloc." Is how much of that is playing into why this is suddenly on the president's radar and why he puts it on the country's?
That could be a part of it. I think he wants to de-enfranchise the community as much as possible. So if he can fabricate stories to create us versus them, and make the community feel alone and feel like no leaders have their backs, that plays to exactly what he wants, right? He wants to divide and conquer. What we're seeing here in Minnesota is our leaders, particularly our Democratic leaders, are stepping up. We are also seeing some Republican leaders step up. Earlier, when he said that, I sent a letter to all the leaders in the Minnesota House and Senate asking them to condemn our Lisa Dameth, who's the Speaker of the House, who's also running for governor, currently seeking the endorsement of Donald Trump, has not condemned it. Her colleague in the Minnesota Senate, who's a colleague of mine, Jim Abler, who's a Republican, did condemn and sent a letter to the president and said, you should meet Somali people. What you're saying about them is heinous, and it is wrong, and it's vile, and it's not representative of the Somali citizens and my friends that I have. That is a Republican leader in this moment who's stepping up. But no, majority of them are in lockstep with Washington, are afraid of Donald Trump calling them out, or making a post on True Social and saying, don't support Lisa Dameth. And so what we're seeing is leaders not do their part, but we are seeing few of them do. And I think that's something important to note. Yes, elections are next year. It is certainly playing a role. Republicans want to take control of Minnesota. But I think what Donald Trump said is not going to allow that to happen.
Minnesota State Senator Zainab Mohammed, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.